Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Dewitt and I will talk in this lecture about two music projects I did in the 1980s, which were Zero Karma and the previous project Corpses Catatonic. And I will also talk about the cassette label Nekrophile Records, on which these projects were originally published. Especially Zero Karma's album, The Secret Eye of Lila, is, besides some other recordings by SBK and Current 93, commonly regarded as a key album for the genre ritual or ritual industrial. And it is this subgenre of industrial, or better to say post-industrial, that most recordings on Nekrophile Records could be attributed to. In this above diagram, I have tried to outline a structural scheme that shows the position of Nekrophile Records and its featured bands in relation to the main industrial projects like Throbbing Crystal, Cabaret Voltaire and SBK. Nekrophile Records was founded in 1983. And this was a time when Throbbing Crystal already had broken up, and their follow-up project, Psychic TV, was in a beginning phase. Many of the bands and musicians on Nekrophile Records came from the surroundings of Psychic TV or were somehow related to them. Moreover, the step from Throbbing Crystal to Psychic TV was marked by a general shift of themes and musical style. Instead of martial electronics and the use of irritating images, an influence of magic and occultism became predominant, which was accompanied by a more calm and meditative style of music. These changes, one could say, marked the transition from industrial to post-industrial, and led to the emergence of a ritual form of industrial music. This is more or less the main background from which Nekrophile Records developed. Before I go deeper into the subject of ritual industrial and its relevant projects, I would like to give a short survey on the classic form of industrial and some of its influences, as far as they seem, at least from my point of view, important for the development of the musical underground of the 1980s. The most influential band in the development of industrial music was, of course, Throbbing Crystal. They existed in their original manifestation from 1976 till 1981 and had originally developed out of an art context, namely the extreme performance and body art project Cum Transmissions. The Cum members, Genesis P. Orridge and Cosi Fanny Tutti, who worked during that time also as a porn actress of, for example, Lasse Brown videos, were later accompanied by Peter Sleazy Christofferson, a theater designer and programmer, and Chris Carter, who had some experience with synthesizers and light shows. The performances of Cum Transmissions were designated to breach any conventional taboo within the art world, as for example by live BDSM performances, including blood, urine and the exhibition of used tampons, while showing hardcore sex and fist-fucking videos. In a sense, their performances went into a similar direction as those of the Viennese actionists like Mühl, Bruce, Nietzsche and Schwarzkugler. In order to reach a wider audience, the members of Cum Transmissions carried the disturbing approach of their performances into the field of experimental music and formed the band Throbbing Crystal. Although some of their musical influences can be traced from the 1960s psychedelic underground, early electronic music, and even the first steps in electric fusion jazz that were done by Miles Davis around 1970, their newly created style was more a radical break with all musical conventions than a continuation of them. The sounds of Throbbing Crystal were harsh, yet sometimes also calm and hypnotic electronics, as it had not been heard before. Their songs dealt with Cyclone B or the murders of the Manson family, and in their logo and martial outfits, they appropriated a kind of fascist aesthetics, which sometimes made it difficult to decide whether it was meant critical or in favor of totalitarian social systems. Although this attitude was obviously used as a subversive strategy, some other protagonists of industrial and post-industrial were still more indifferent to that point and expressed open sympathy for nationalist and right-wing positions. To my mind, this issue is not yet fully worked up, as the borders between critical subversion and affirmation are fluent and thus open up to a wide field of doubtful appropriations that sometimes are, at least in my opinion, too easily justified as simply being art or music. Derived from the name of their label Industrial Records and its slogan Industrial Music for Industrial People, they established with their new and powerful style the genre industrial, to which besides Throbbing Crystal, a few other bands like SBK and Cabaret Voltaire could be assigned. A common feature of them was the combination of aggressive or threatening electronic sounds with shocking or provocative contents, by which they created a kind of subversive aesthetics that could be seen as a radical application of William Burroughs' ideas on information warfare, as outlined in his essay The Electronic Revolution. In this text, Burroughs developed the idea to use cut-ups of sound recordings as a subversive weapon against repressive institutions. Another important influence for Throbbing Crystal came from the American painter Brian Gysin, who invented the Dream Machine, a rotating cylinder that was designed to induce trance states by flickering light impulses. Brian Gysin, by the way, was named by Genesis P. Orridge also as his tutor in the field of magic. This point is insofar of interest as it shows that there was already in early times of Kuhn transmission an inclination of Genesis P. Orridge towards magic and occultism. Whether it was Burroughs, Gysin, Charles Manson, or the sect leader Jim Jones, who committed with 900 of his followers a mass suicide in 1978, all these personal obsessions and interests of Genesis P. Orridge finally became the leading images connected with industrial and were reproduced within the subculture in a quite stereotypical way as codes and icons of identification for followers and fans. Although the use of irritating images was partly still intended to be shocking in the work of Kuhn transmissions, their general role within industrial could also be seen as a strategy to face the negative contents of a society, and thus to make their suppressed energy available to the individual by conscious acknowledgement. For other bands like SBK, whose work was concerned with psychiatry, pathology, and forensic sciences, different theoretical influences were important. As SBK's founding member, Graham Revell, wrote to me in a letter from 1983, He had spent 1 year in Paris studying and attending the lectures of Baudrillard, Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari, Lyotard and others, which to him had been a great source of inspiration and much more influential than any musical groups. At least to me, there was still one more important influence, which were Artaud's ideas on the theatre of cruelty, a direct actionist form of theatre that was aimed at intense bodily experiences and implied the use of cacophonic music, screams and ritualistic elements of expression. Both the performance art of the 1960s and 70s, as well as the industrial culture that was developed out of them, could be seen as manifestations of such ideas. Somehow at this point, my own process of getting into contact with the underground of industrial music began. At the age of 19, when bands like Robin Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire were already my favorites, I wrote a small book with notes that were mainly influenced by Artaud and the writings of his German translator Bernd Mattheus. It was printed shortly afterwards by a Viennese publisher who introduced me to an underground network that was mainly based on postal exchange and tightly connected with the subculture of industrial music. This underground network had originally developed out of contacts within the mail art and fluxus scene that had been utilized by Genesis P. Orridge in the early 1970s to promote the activities of Qum transmissions. There was a flourishing exchange of underground scenes, newsletters, music cassettes and records on vinyl that were, apart from the established music industry, distributed by alternative mail order companies. During that time, it was around 1982, it happened that a girlfriend suggested to me that I should take less drugs and instead do something useful with my energies. As a consequence, I bought a used Korg MS-20 synthesizer, which I later supplemented by a SQ10 analog synthesizer and started to make my first tracks of electronic music. At the same time, I started to study electroacoustic music at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna under Dieter Kaufmann, an Austrian composer of electroacoustic music. Besides some insights into the tradition of electroacoustic music in the 20th century, the most important thing we learned there was how to edit audio tapes and how to make tape loops, a technique that I used both for Corpses Catatonic as well as for Sirocama. Another big advantage of this course was that we could use 2 small studios under the roof of the beautiful Wiener Konzerthaus, which enabled me to combine the single tracks that I recorded at home to multi-track compositions. For these first tracks, I used my synth and sequencer, a guitar, 2 effect pedals, and a Revox tape machine for loops and analog echo effects. In April 1983, I finally published my first collection of recordings under the name of Corpses Catatonic by producing a cassette edition of, I think, 200 copies. As the name of the label, I decided to use Nekrophile Records, which for me seemed to match perfectly with the dark and sinister atmosphere of this recording. The title of the cassette, Subclinical Leukotomy Aphrenia Spasmophylic Lysophobo asphyxia, sinister, latel, anorex, indicated already in some ironical way that the whole album was strongly influenced by SPK, which was, depending on the respective publication, used as an abbreviation for System Planning Corporation, Surgical Penis Clinic or Sozialistisches Patientenkollektiv. This game with an abbreviation, Corpses Catatonic, repeated with the letters SLA, referring to the Symbionist Liberation Army, an American terrorist group of the 1970s, which appear in the title and other inscriptions of the cassette. From this first cassette of Nekrophile Records, I will now play extracts from the tracks Nicom, Cock Transplant, Scacisco, and Occipital Slash. In order to promote my cassette release, I produced a small number of newsletters which were spread within the mentioned underground network. In these newsletters, I developed a kind of philosophy for Nekrophile Records, which better could be described as delirious writings comprising the fields of mental disease, oppression by restrictive state apparatuses, and the fight for liberation of the individual's will by subversive use of noise and music. To break these writings down to a more understandable formula, I would say that their general idea was that it is a political act to face the negative and suppressed contents of a society. This could have an emancipatory effect on the individual, and a way to achieve this goal was by music, which deals with these suppressed and negative contents. Besides these writings, I also had this sticker printed which showed the Nekrophile logo and reverted the slogan of the music industry, "Home taping is killing music," which should people keep off from copying vinyl records onto music cassettes. By my contacts within the mentioned underground network, I heard of a recording by Robin Gristle, which had not been published until that time. It was entitled "What's History?" and existed only in a very few private copies that were circulated within that network. I had the idea to publish this recording as the second release on Nekrophile Records, and wrote to Genesis P. Orridge, who agreed with the publication, yet told me that it was in fact not a recording by T.G., but rather done by himself and Stan Bingo, a close associate who had a band called Last Few Days. The recording was intended as a blueprint for the soundtrack of Derek Jarman's film In the Shadow of the Sun, as well as a blueprint for the music of Psychic TV in general. As I was informed, the recording of the single 40 minutes track took place in Genesis' bedroom, and the date of the recording was the 14th of January 1981. I will play now a short piece of it. The mentioned date of January 1981 is insofar interesting as this was still before the split of Throbbing Crystal, who played their last concert in May 1981. It thus shows that Genesis P-Orridge was already at that time thinking about and working on a follow-up project. After the breakup of TG, which according to Cozy was caused by a personal breakup between Genesis and herself, P-Orridge and Christofferson founded Psychic TV, while Tutti and Carter continued their musical collaboration as Chris and Cozy. Compared with Throbbing Crystal, the emergence of Psychic TV brought a significant shift both regarding the musical style and the featured themes, so that one could say that this development marked the transition from industrial to post-industrial. While TG had mainly worked with electronic sounds, or at least electronically modified sounds of traditional instruments, there were on the first LP of Psychic TV lovely songs accompanied by acoustic guitar, string arrangements, or tracks reminiscent of Ennio Morricone's Western soundtracks. Besides that, an influence of occultism and magic became predominant. Psychic TV presented themselves not as a band, but rather as the propaganda arm of the Temple of Psychic Youth, in short TOPY, a sect-like cult which had as its symbol a three-barred cross, and whose members were performing simultaneously a sex magic ritual on the 23rd of each month in order to make some personal wish come true. This magical practice was loosely based on the writings of Austin Osman Spare, an English artist and occultist of the first half of the 20th century. In his writings, Spare devised a kind of psycholinguistic sorcery which usually is called sigil magic. Sigils were gained by formulating a wish and combining the letters of this sentence to a simple glyph so that its meaning escapes the conscious mind. By concentrating on such sigils, in trance states or during an orgasm, according to Spare, the content of the wish could be transmitted to the unconscious and thus affect its fulfillment. The use of magic and other elements that somehow characterized the style of activities within the Temple of Psychic Youth also could be regarded as a modern form of Tantrism, an ancient Indian system of philosophy that included, at least in its left-hand form called Vamamarga, the ritual use of negative and otherwise tabooed elements like sexuality, death, and sorcery, as a means for spiritual development. Members of the Temple of Psychic Youth, as well as temporarily musicians of Psychic TV, were, besides the founding members, John Balance, David Dewitt, and the singer of Soft Cell, Mark Almond. To the irritation of my friends who had considered myself being more reasonable and critical, I became too a member of the temple in the winter of 1983-84. Yet I didn't stay for very long, as the cult, which originally had claimed to be aimed at the emancipation of the individual, soon seemed to repeat the authoritarian structures of other sect-like communities. Nevertheless, this short association gave the impetus towards my second musical project, Zero Karma, and besides that also led to an extensive pen friendship with John Balance, which started when he was my main contact person within TOPY. Our letter exchange mainly took place from 1983 through 1985 and thus covered exactly the period when John developed his project Coil and I created my own project Zero Karma. This background was the reason that the first ever published Coil track was released in 1983 on the third Nekrophile cassette, which was released in 1983 and entitled The Beast 666, dedicated to Aleister Crowley, the infamous occultist and icon of 20th century magic. On the same compilation was also the first track of Zero Karma, for which I had combined the chants of Tibetan monks with the sounds of small cymbals and a rat cage that was used as a percussion instrument. I'm going to play now this first ever published track by Coil with the title Here to Here, Double-Headed Secret, and after that an extract from the first track by Zero Karma entitled We, which was an abbreviation of one of the magical names of Aleister Crowley. Both tracks from the Beast 666 compilation, published in 1983 on Nekrophile Records. The Beast 666 compilation was followed in early 1984 by the first full album of Coil, released as the fourth cassette published on Nekrophile Records. This release, which still comes before the first vinyl release by Coil, was entitled Transparent, which was a reference to Austin Osman Spare, as his name was hidden in the title. The cover drawing was also by Spare, taken from a magical stele that was made for Kenneth Grant in the 1950s, depicting the Babylonian goddess Tiamat. The cassette included on one side the first recorded tracks by Coil, and on the other side a live recording from Berlin Atonal Festival in 1983, where John Balance played with John Gosling and Mean to other Toppy members under the name of Zoskia.
Come back here to this cold rain. I have to rearrange reality to come back. Go. No. You're not going to do this to me. I won't let you do this to me again. You'll not do this to me again. I hate you. No. Ran down my throat. Do you know this? We've all gone mad. We've all gone mad. We've all gone mad by now. Touched by Christ's slim jeweled hand. I have to rearrange reality to come back here to this cold place.
The material of this live recording was mainly supplied by Coil, yet Zoskia, by the way the name of the magical system of Austin Osman Spare, was used by John Gosling as his band name. So the tape was finally published under the split authorship Coil Zoskia, which necessarily led to some conflict when John Balance and Sleazy left the Temple of Psychic Youth later in that year. During that time, John Balance also started to collect drawings of Austin Osman Spare, while I translated Spare's collected writings into German a few years later. Coil became during the following 2 decades one of the most innovative and well-known experimental electronic bands which produced a great number of singles and albums, until John Balance finally died in 2004 after a fall from the second floor of his house in London. 6 years later, also Peter Sleazy Christofferson died in his sleep, so that Coil was history forever. Although I never met him in person, for me John Balance always had been a kind of twin or soul brother with whom I felt deeply connected. Based upon our simultaneous musical beginnings, our pen friendship, as well as our shared interests, especially in the art and magic of Austin Osman Spare. Soon after the release of the Coil tape, I started to work on my own project, as I wanted to record an album by Zero Karma. The first inspiration to this project came through a track on the bonus LP of the first Psychic TV album, Force the Hand of Chance. Its first edition was supplemented by a bonus LP called Psychic TV Themes, which was designed as ritual music for magical workings. On it there was a track entitled 23 Tibetan Human Thigh Bones, which was recorded with the traditional Tibetan bone instruments that were said to be made from monks, virgins, or executed criminals. Sorry, here's one. Based on this track, I had the idea not only to make music with human thigh bones, but to furnish a variety of instruments from human bones and skulls, and to make music with it. After having been told by a friend about a beautiful Gothic yet unlocked charnel house within the cemetery of a small village in Lower Austria, here it is, I went there on a sunny spring day, took what I needed and came back in the evening with 2 large travel bags containing 9 skulls and a great number of other bones. It was a very strange feeling to share my flat from now on with the remains of dozens of deceased human beings, and quite often I had the impression that they were not simply dead matter, but still had somehow parts of their respective souls attached to them. I should add that these bones did not look like the prepared and bleached bones and skulls that we know from anatomical collections, but were often dark brown or green spotted, and some of the skulls had still remains of hair on their surface. Moreover, when I started to saw them up, I had to realize that this produced a very ugly smell, which was really hard to bear. At this point, I also realized that I had transgressed fundamental limits, not only of good taste, but also of what humans in general regard as ethically acceptable. Yet I was at the point of no return, and so started to build my instruments. By sawing off the hip joints and drilling the knee joints of thigh bones, I made trumpets following the Tibetan example. From skulls, the caps were sawn off, and by covering them with sheepskin, I got my first skull drums. From a shank bone, I made a flute, and by adding the mouthpiece of an oboe to a thigh bone, combined with an L, I made further wind instruments. By filling the leftover skull caps with finger bones, I got rattles, and a bone with scores served as a kind of guiro. Finally, by fixing a row of thigh bones of different length on a wooden box, I created a simple xylophone. Some of the instruments were decorated with serpent skin and metal, others painted, but most of them were left blank as they were. When the building of the instruments was finished, also the spooky atmosphere in my flat had disappeared. So as if it had been banned by the working process and transformed into something new. So I could start to record with my bizarre instruments the first simple audio tracks, which went quite well so far. As recording devices, I had a 4-track cassette recorder and mixing desk, as well as a Rekords tape machine, which enabled me to play loops and create analog echo effects. By using the different speed settings, I also could play some recorded tracks in half speed, which sometimes gave the dry bone sounds a deeper resonance. For the required rhythm tracks, in most cases 2 or 3 cycles were enough to create a loop. In general, the instruments worked quite well, at least as far as I needed it to make some primitive music. Moreover, some of the tracks sounded very similar to the music I was inspired by, be it Tibetan ritual music or Arabic Bedouin music, as for example the famous Pipes of Pan at Uyuka that was produced by Brian Jones in 1968. The whole recording took place in the living room of my small flat in the 9th district of Vienna, which you can see here. In less than 3 weeks, I had enough material for my planned album, which I published in September 1984 as the 5th cassette release on Nekrophile Records, under the title The Secret Eye of Lila. From this cassette I will play now extracts from the tracks Atavism Dream, Night of Meta, Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, Love Always Yieldeth, and Azure-Lidded Woman, Pregnant Womb of None. regarding the title, The Secret Eye of Lila, and the symbolism connected with it, members of the Temple of Psychic Youth received, when being affiliated in the cult, a stereotype name which consisted of Kali for female and Eden for male members, combined with a number that presumably was chosen after the order of admission. When I affiliated myself to the cult in January 1984, I received the name Eden 77, which obviously was a very powerful number, as it seemed to have, by the double occurrence of the magical 7, a very special occult flair. According to Kabbalistic numerology, which was one of my fields of interest at the time, 77 was the numerical value of the Arab word and forename Lila, which meant night, and also that of the Hebrew word Ots, which meant a he-goat, suggestive of the Christian devil, and in occult terms a symbol of the unrestrained creative force of nature. This idea is also reflected in the Zero Karma logo, which is made out of the symbol of an eye and a sword, which are the meanings of the Hebrew letters O and Z, adding up to Ots, the he-goat again. Around this symbolism I constructed the whole theme of the album and its title, The Secret Eye of Lila, thus referred to the cosmic unity of the two basic opposite forces within nature, night, death and dissolution into nothingness, and the unrestrained sexual force of creation as its counterbalance, that emerges from it and overcomes all eternal decay. In this respect, the recording was for me also a kind of alchemical act in which the cruelty of death was transformed into an immaterial manifestation of beauty in form of music. This opinion was of course not shared by everyone. I remember, for example, the final exam at the university course for electroacoustic music in Vienna, where the first time also the head of the institute, the composer Roman Haubenstock-Ramati, was present. After Dieter Kaufmann had presented some tracks of my work and explained the construction of the instruments to him, Haubenstock-Ramati turned away in disgust and said that he never had heard something more nauseating, which perhaps can be seen as a compliment too. By the way, shortly after the release of The Secret Eye of Lila, the musicians of a band with whom I had been in contact, it was Met Gumnebone from Newcastle upon Tyne, also tried to get some bones from their local cemetery, but had been less successful, as they were caught by the police and sentenced to do some social service in the following year, as can be seen from these newspaper cuttings. 1 year later, I was invited by the NL Centrum Amsterdam to do 2 live performances of Zero Karma in the Netherlands. As it was not really possible to use the bone instruments for a live gig, I asked some friends and friends of friends to support me in these concerts with traditional instruments as drums, bass and guitar. Our program included also some kind of performance parts involving BDSM actions and the use of animal blood, which I had ordered from the organizers of these concerts. In these performance parts there can be found an obvious influence of Viennese actionism, which is due to the fact that I had participated only a few months after recording The Secret Eye of Lila in the 3 days game of Hermann Nietzsche's Orges Mysteries Theater. I will play a passage from the concert in Arnhem. It has been released on CD in 2008, and show you some photos made in Amsterdam and Arnhem, which were until today the only public appearances of Zero Karma. My co-musicians were Muki Pakesh, with whom I had attended the ELAC course at the Music Academy, as well as the Niche Action. Then Didi Neidhardt, who is now quite well known as musician, DJ and music journalist, as well as my girlfriend of that time, David Aranios. Wolfgang Lehner, an Austrian director of photography, projected Super 8 films, which were intended to be used in a Zero Karma video project. And the mixing was done by Martin Wich, aka Das Viech, a Viennese punk legend who unfortunately had passed away some years later. There was a kind of balance between persons who were able to play music instruments and others that had almost no experience in this field, so that the music of these concerts had a somehow improvised and ad hoc character, as it was developed only for the purpose of these gigs. Before that, I will play part of a short interview with Zero Karma that was produced by Radio Stad Amsterdam on occasion of these concerts.
Een van de redenen voor deze primeur is het nogal ongebruikelijke instrumentarium dat Zero Karma gekozen heeft. Zij maken muziek op instrumenten die geheel zijn opgebouwd uit menselijke resten. Voor de muziek die je tijdens dit programma hoort, afkomstig van de cassette The Secret Eye of Laila, uitgekomen op Nekrophile Rekords, maakten ze gebruik van dijbeentrompetten en bewerkte menselijke beenderen tot fluitjes en xylofoons.
As drums we did use skulls, of which the caps had been sewn off, and which were prepared as drums with skin, and so they were all very simple instruments. I built all by myself, and I don't need it more than one day for one instrument to build this. And I think they don't sound like bones, they sound like instruments.
Het gebruik van botten als instrument is bedoeld als alternatief voor het stereotype synthesizertje van de cliché-muzikant.
To build your own instruments from very elemental material. You have this material and you have to find the bones, you have to make the instruments of this material. It's a very, very basic thing, and it's not to go to synthesizer, and it also has a political meaning in our society. Or what is concerned with death is moved beside and it's digged in the earth, and nobody wants to see it. And we demonstrated that you can also make from this things which have a large amount of beauty.
De ideeën achter de muziek van Zero Karma komen voort uit de leerstellingen van de kerk van 2CR11, die ze vanavond in het NL-centrum hopen te kunnen introduceren. De religie van 2CR11 gaat ervan uit dat alle energie die een mens ter beschikking staat, seksuele energie is.
It's the basic process in the whole universe, and it's the principle of creation and of developing in whole nature and the whole universe. It's always uniting opposite pairs and the desire of uniting opposite pairs and to create one new thing.
Middels een bepaald soort intensief orgasme kunnen volgens de leer van 2CR11 deze krachten van liefde en dood bij elkaar komen.
It has some basic common force. And if you look at the words, it is this statement is based on the numerical value, but you can also, it's a very obvious thing that love and death is something similar. It's dissolution, Auflösung. Yeah? And you can obtain this dissolution by an orgasm, or you can obtain it by death, or by any method you would prefer. It's union and dissolution. In France, an orgasm is called little death. I don't know the word exactly, but it's called little death. And I think this is a very obvious thing. It's union and dissolution. Union of opposites, and by this way dissolution. And becoming the whole. Not only a half, not only man or woman. The end of desire.
Als je kennis wilt nemen van de muziek en ideeën van Zero Kama, ben je vanavond welkom in het NL-centrum Rozengracht 168.
Also in 1985 I published a second compilation with the opulent title The Archangels of Sex Rule the Destruction of the Regime, including tracks by Zero Karma, Sleep Chamber, Ein Sof and Metgumnebone. In 1986 two albums by Italian ritual projects followed. The first one was Tum Esh Neit by Lashtal, and the second one was Ars Regia by Ein Sof, which was the last cassette released to be published on Nekrophile Records. During that time I also recorded the last track by Zero Karma, which was based on a verse of Aleister Crowley's main book, The Book of the Law, or Liber Alve Legis. It was published on a double LP compilation entitled QED by the NL Zentrum Amsterdam in 1988. Besides Zero Karma, this compilation included tracks by most other artists that had performed in the NL Zentrum, including SBK, Chris and Cozy, Zeff, Einstürzende Neubauten, Leibach, and also from Austria, Konrad Becker of Monoton. This last Zero Karma track sounded like this. At the same time, the French label Permis de Construire asked to produce a vinyl version of The Secret Eye of Lila, which was to be released in 1988. Despite of this first vinyl releases, I had the feeling that it didn't make much sense to continue making music as Zero Karma. One reason was that I was not able to create the same sublime music as on The Secret Eye of Lila when playing with other musicians or in a live situation. If on the other hand I would have continued as a solo musician, I would have been condemned to repeat and copy myself. So I came to the conclusion that I could do nothing better than I had already done and decided to stop making music at all. The plan to set the whole text of Crowley's Liber Alve Legis to music was abandoned, and in the same way the work on a video for The Secret Eye of Lila by me and Wolfgang Lehner remained unfinished. The Super 8 material we had already recorded for it, containing lots of ritualistic and sexual explicit images that were taken in my small apartment, have, unfortunately or not survived. In 1990, I gave most of the instruments away and kept only two. These two. In the same year, I sold all master tapes and the name Nekrophile Records to Stahlblatt in Amsterdam. They continued to publish the Nekrophile releases on CD during the early 1990s. Mostly with randomly placed artwork and inscriptions, as can be seen on the What's History CD, which had the spare artwork of the coil cassette on it. The two compilations were re-released on one CD and 4 tracks, including the first coil track, were omitted. According to the cover notes, there was a European branch of Nekrophile Records in Amsterdam and a US department in Portland, Oregon. In the late 1980s, I withdrew more and more in my private life, as well as into a more intense study of occultism. At that time, some of the people who were interested in occultism and magic during the Topi times became involved in chaos magic and the rise of another occult organization, the Illuminates of Thanateros, IoT. It had as its members again me and John Balance, whose magical name was then Frater Loki, which was an anagram of his band name Coil. Finally, I distanced myself more and more from occultism, both from Aleister Crowley's system, which still had been a source of inspiration in the beginnings of Nekrophile Records, as well as later from chaos magic, which too seemed to be based on fundamental misconceptions. Nevertheless, very important for my own thinking remain the writings of Austin Osman Spare, which I translated in 1989 and finally published in 1990. After some years of publishing books, I realized that I still have somehow to express myself and started to work as a fine artist. Besides, I started to write again and develop my own theories on how we create reality by our unconscious conceptions, which still were based on my experiences in the field of magic, but which I now try to express in a philosophical context. I still try to communicate this philosophy in my lecture performances, and sometimes, this I had to realize when preparing this lecture, I still revolve around points which I was already talking about in the earliest writings published by Nekrophile Records. Although it was not the least my intention, the years of reclusiveness still enhanced the mysterious image of Zero Karma and also created a kind of schizophrenic situation. Whereas I started to live a private life in the Austrian Alps, where no one knew something about my previous musical activities, those people all around the world who knew my work did not know anything about the person behind it. This somehow lasted until the emergence of social media like MySpace and Facebook, which brought these separate parts together again. When I had my first look at MySpace, I realized that there was a huge fan community of Zero Karma with many hundred followers. And this finally made it possible to get in contact with some of these persons, communicate with them, or realize some collaborative projects. This situation also led to some re-releases and new publications. In 2001, the French label Athanor published a 10-inch vinyl, The Goatherd and the Beast Collected Tracks 1983 till 1986, which united all Zero Karma tracks that were recorded besides The Secret Eye of Lila. In 2008 followed Live in Arnhem, the recording of one of the concerts from 1985, and 1 year ago, in 2014, a digitally remastered version of The Secret Eye of Lila was released in red vinyl. Additionally, in 2012, all recordings of Corpses Catatonic were re-released under the title Œuvres Complètes on the Viennese Klanggallery label. Also in 2012, Boo Records from Lima in Peru published under the title Return to Lila, Tribute to Zero Karma, a compilation CD with 16 international bands who were inspired by Zero Karma or followed paths of ritual music which I had stricken in the past. This was really a cool acknowledgement of my work, of which I'm very proud, and I will now play some tracks out of this wonderful compilation. The first track is by Brian Buck from Peru, the second from Blue Bay, Argentina, and the third one is by Zeph, the well-known percussionist and sound artist from USA, who plays here to a distorted Zero Karma track. with some of the musicians from this compilation. I had during the last years collaborations in my lecture performances. When doing my first lecture performance 2011 in Rome, I asked Mushi, who said of herself that she originally was inspired to make music by Zero Karma, to accompany my lecture with some electronic sounds. And when I realized within Anna Khodorkovskaya's online art project Reality Raum Residenz, my 1 week durational performance, Performative Thinking Acts, The Wish, I invited the musicians and bands of this compilation to contribute live concerts via Skype. One of these artists was Shatsula, a psychedelic experimental musician, DJ and filmmaker from Belgium, who made for my performance at Reality Raum Residenz a video, of which I want to show you now one extract. Yet the influence of Zero Karma was not restricted to the field of dark ambient music. Also death metal bands had a special relation to Zero Karma. In 1991, the Greek metal band Rotting Christ used the Zero Karma sample at the end of their song Forest of Engai. And in 2005, the American death metal band Hate Eternal used not only a Zero Karma sample for the song I Monarch, but also had in their video a young actor who impersonated me, handling the bones playing the instruments and drinking blood very similar as it could be seen on the few existing photos of Zero Karma. This is really crazy shit. Most of the videos we saw before you can find on YouTube. And if you Google Zero Karma, you can also find things like that. This is just one further example of what can become reality when you don't care at all to promote your own work. As can be seen, the seeds I planted with Zero Karma still continue to bear strange fruits. And even if it was not always easy for me to mention the project in my biography, Zero Karma cannot be thought away from my life. and has now become a vital part of my artistic identity. So my lecture is now finished, and we can make a coffee break and perhaps afterwards talk a little bit. I can answer questions. And if someone is interested, I also have some records and CDs with me. Most of them are out of print, so if someone is interested, you can have them. Thank you very much.
It's dissolution. Auflösung. And I think this is a very obvious thing. It's union and dissolution. Union of opposites. And by this way dissolution. And becoming the whole. Not only a half. Not only man or woman. The end of desire. 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 The end of desire.